I'm Stuart Mangrum, and once again, I'm introducing at least one person who requires little introduction. That would be Burning Man's President and Chief Philosophical Officer and founder, Larry Harvey, over here. Mr. Harvey. And perhaps Burning Man's most prolific writer, blogger, bon vivant. You may know him from his Burning Man journal pieces. This is Caveat Magister. And in our spare time, the three of us also hold down something known as the Philosophical Center, which, for those of you who may not have heard about the Philosophical Center, I'm just going to read you a brief mission. It is a shared philosophy permeates every aspect of Burning Man culture. This ethos is the living heart of our community, our conscience, and our collective memory. Outlined in the 10 principles, but more fully revealed in our actions, it informs everything that we do. For our culture to survive and flourish, we must continually work to nourish these core values. We refer to this ongoing mission of stewardship and scholarship as the Philosophical Center. Yeah, I hold down the stewardship, and they hold down the scholarship portions of that. So I don't know what you guys want to talk about, but I don't know. I was thinking there are two things that my mama always said you should never talk about at the dinner table. Are there any mothers here today? Do you know what are those two things that we're not supposed to talk about at polite dinner time? Okay, it wasn't just my mom. Right? It was politics and religion. That's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with the R word. So Larry, we can't help but notice that this year's theme is radical ritual, that you're not shying away from questions of religion and spirituality. The man is going to be inside a temple this year, and your theme essay quotes from varieties of religious experience. Let's be real, is Burning Man a religion? Is that what you're saying?
Well, if you'd read the essay, you'd know the answer.
I did actually, and there was a section titled, Is Burning Man a Religion? And I read it twice, and I'm not sure what exactly it said. I was hoping you could, something maybe to nail you down a little bit on that one.
Well, it says a few things that are definite. It says, first of all, it says if you look at immediate experience in a religious context, I use as an example the burning of the temple and the burning of the man, or the raising of the man originally on Baker Beach, and they're virtually indistinguishable from religious experience, practically speaking. But then I go on to say what is conspicuously absent is a supernatural agency, and I think that if you're talking about religion as we usually esteem it, that sort of lets us off that particular hook, because no one has ever suggested that the man is a numinous object that is representative of any kind of God. There may be some of you, of course, you are free to believe that. The motto of the Philosophic Center is belief is thought at rest. And if you do believe that, maybe you should get up and, ask a few questions of yourself. I did more or less conclude that we're not the subtitle of that essay is Spirit and Soul. And I did say, I reached into the world of the natural, not the supernatural, to explain, to describe immediate experiences that have such spiritual resonance for so many.
So was that a yes or a no? I mean,
you've got to think about it.
To talk about religion without a spiritual agency, without a supernatural agency, I did look up the word religion in the dictionary. And the first definition is, what is this? The belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power. So you don't mean religion in that sense of the word religion?
No, it's not that at all.
Okay. But I want to go back to the idea of people reading it as a religion and creating that own sense of belief for themselves. One of my favorite thinkers, the situationist Ralph Vaneigem, wrote, you know I was going to work this in somewhere, that God may have been abolished, but the pillars which once held him aloft still rise to an empty sky, which speaks to me to some sort of a need that's missing in modern man to create some sort of a religion. There are those who argue that Burning Man is a synthetic religion, that people are making a religion out of it.
Is anyone in this room making a religion out of it? Let's see some hands. Come on, don't be shy.
Okay, well, let's look at it through a different lens. Caveat, you've written a lot about humanism and how Burning Man looks when looked at through a humanist lens. Those of you who are not familiar with the school of thought of humanism, you may have at least heard the expression secular humanism, which is kind of a code word that religious conservatives use to condemn science as a religion. So I'm just curious, are the 10 principles an expression of humanist ideals, and is Burning Man a godless religion?
Well, I would say that Burning Man emerges out of the project of humanism, broadly defined, absolutely, in the sense that humanism puts the human experience at the heart of the endeavor, and in that sense, so does Burning Man. I mean, immediacy is the giveaway right there. What are you experiencing now? But likewise, self-expression, radical self-expression, is your self-expression. It's not measured against some imposed standard or higher authority of self-expression. It's what you are expressing. Likewise, gifting, these are your gifts. You are not giving a gift on behalf of another, whether that is another person, a greater force, an entity or organization. When you give gifts, you're not giving gifts on behalf of Burning Man, you're giving your gift. And so in that sense, the 10 principles are a part of the humanist endeavor in that they put your experience at the center of what you're doing. That said, is Burning Man a godless religion? I wouldn't think so, and I think it's not, precisely because the 10 principles, the whole Burning Man experience makes a very limited claim on what you ought to believe and what you ought to think of the world. Burning Man has no position on whether or not you should hold the standard model of quantum physics or believe in the multiple world hypothesis. It doesn't suggest that there is a better high yield checking account. There are all kinds of questions up and into the question of do you believe in a God that are simply not relevant for how you are engaging with the 10 principles. If it's really important to your life, okay, if it's something you bring into it, but this has nothing to do with the 10 principles, it has nothing to do with Burning Man, it has to do with your experience of burning, it has to do with this experience that you are moving towards, and if that's what you are looking for, then yes, the 10 principles are exactly what you want to look at, what you want to try to live by, but you know, how far you go with that is entirely up to you. I don't think it's a godless religion because I think it makes very limited claims on our reality, on what it is that we are trying to accomplish in our broader lives. Quite the contrary. It's a process by which you encounter other things that might very well be meaningful to you.
So I'm starting to sense some agreement around this. Does that always happen in the Philosophical Center? What happens if you guys don't agree? Is there some sort of dispute resolution process? Is there a Thunderdome of philosophy?
The first rule about Philosophical Fight Club is you don't talk about Philosophical Fight Club.
We arm wrestle, but that is a thought experiment. We don't actually exert ourselves.
You know, I remember many, many years ago, Larry, when our hair was still really dark. I do remember actually a fairly serious discussion on the playa where some people that we know and respect were urging us pretty strongly to form Burning Man into a church for the First Amendment protections, for the tax protection.
That would be our lawyer, Terry Gross, actually.
There were others who really argued very strongly that that was a good position to take, but you chose not to.
Yes, I told Terry that if we turned it into a religion, someone would shoot me.
So that explains, okay, I remember at the time you were also reading that biography of Joseph Smith.
Yeah, it's very instructive.
Okay, that does explain a lot. Okay, so let's talk about ritual a little bit here. I'm curious about the use of that word specifically in this year's theme, because people interpret it so radically differently. There are people who talk about brushing their teeth in the morning as being a ritual, or having their coffee in the morning, or what are basically just repetitive behaviors. Isn't a lot of ritual basically just a lack of imagination?
I wouldn't say that. I don't. You can conceive that brushing your teeth in the morning is a ritual, but really at the core of ritual is a sense of certainly the sense of communion with others, and unless you're brushing your teeth with 40 of your best friends, I think it lacks that element. So it's more than. That's a rather crude understanding. It's not anything that's continually repeated, and the value of it has a lot to do with the sense of common being with others.
Mm-hmm.
You have any thoughts?
Yeah.
As part of the the series of blog posts we're doing this year on radical ritual on the Burning Man Journal, I interviewed anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann, who made a wonderful point that ritual determines what you pay attention to. That is to say, even if, and I think we can all agree that how you brush your teeth in the morning is probably a very piddling and trifling example of a ritual, but if you're serious about it, it determines what you are paying attention to when you brush your teeth. And in many respects, what you pay attention to in your life determines the kind of person you are, determines the kind of world you live in. So in fact, there is a degree to which, if you take ritual seriously, if you are in fact engaged in it, then it is having an impact on the kind of person you are and the kind of world you live in. And in that sense is not trivial at all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, take that.
All right. Is there something to be said for the notion of ritual encoding cultural values and transmitting them across the generations and across the years?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sometimes it's rough to be the one asking the questions. Next year, you're going to do it again. Why don't we move on to politics? What do you think? I don't know. So Larry, a lot of what we're talking about this weekend is people who are taking what they've learned as burners out into the world, becoming more politically active. What advice would you give to people to go out and be more active as citizens while still being within the realm of the 10 principles? How does our philosophy impact that?
Well, let me take that a little sideways. I've actually heard a lot of talk by folks that Burning Man isn't political. It's not political. We don't talk about it's not. Well, first of all, if you were an organizer of Burning Man, and many of you are organizers of events, you would know that if you do that work, you end up waist deep in politics. It just as an existential order it's an existential need for it in order to survive. And so Burning Man from as organizers, from our point of view, is saturated with politics and always has been. We do the politics, so there's no, to spare others that. Secondly, here's a quiz. We did a very political theme a few years back. Who knows what that theme was? American Dream, which was pretty interesting. It was instantly and widely denounced by people who had only read the title, and they assumed that this was an apology. That this was that this theme must surely imply that we were top nation and the hegemon of the world. And in fact, if they'd read it, it said that we're becoming just have a seat at the table anymore. And indeed, We built an obelisk. The man stood on it. Had every flag of every nation on the world, and it was a beautiful object. It had every flag except for one, our own, and no one noticed that. Nor did anyone notice that, in fact, when it was written, that was back in 2008, wasn't it? That it all but predicted the coming stock market crash. And so it was actually rather, it was a very critical examination of patriotism and what that might mean. I wasn't really worried. I had a lot of confidence in it, but my faith was rewarded. When I drove into the event that year, the first thing I saw was 3 DPW people by the side of the gate road who were wearing, had bandanas across their foreheads that were red, white, and blue, some sort of weird caution tape. And I thought, we've got the DPW, we've got them. So that was political speech, and I'll add one other thing. That year, we were graced with the presence of someone out of from the White House, and a staffer, and several other federal folks, and we took him out on an art car, and we drove past a very large installation of a biplane that had smashed into the White House, and
Too soon?
What's that?
Too soon.
Fortunately, some skydivers distracted them a little bit, and then I just gestured sideways to the patriotic catastrophe on our right, and said, you know, people just do the craziest things. And then we just moved on to the next sensation. So, and it actually, that theme produced a fascinating art. Not everything does. And so that was political, too. I endorsed a candidate for office in San Francisco. But when I did so, I said, I'm speaking as a citizen of this city. I'm not speaking for Burning Man. I don't know how anybody could say they were speaking for Burning Man. You know, I represent the unified rank and file position of all the burners. I don't think so. But you can use, I think, as a rubric for activism, you can, it wouldn't be a bad thing to consult the 10 principles, because if you did, it might make you very, it might increase your political aptitude. It might suggest to you that even if you have opponents, you really ought to not waste your time in turning them into a cartoon of evil, but rather ask yourself what motivates them, how do they see the world, how do they feel about things, and how does what they say correspond to that human reality. It will make you a lot more effective in dealing with opposition. There's nothing wrong with nothing. Hell, we have gone through so many political battles. It's funny, but always in such a way that we tended to always tended to take the high ground, because we are the high ground, and if you do that, then when the battle's over, especially if you win, your opponent doesn't remember you with rancor and bitterness, because that doesn't really, in the longer term, that's not going to give you that political power that you want in order to do what you feel is right and good.
I noticed you didn't mention the principle of radical inclusion in that answer, Larry. That's the one that I think I'm the most concerned about, honestly. Politics is inherently divisive, and when people, particularly when in partisan politics, when people start taking sides, don't we run the risk of alienating potential allies and not being able to have that big tent that everyone is welcome in?
Well, you have to take sides in politics. I mean, do you really think that the politics is about everybody agreeing effortlessly?
I was thinking more along the lines of if I say we all here dislike Trump, don't we?
No, there are probably a few people.
I don't think we'd all necessarily, I know we
Yeah.
wouldn't necessarily agree on that, and that's a discourse that shuts people out.
Well, just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean you've shut them out.
Right. But
The invitation is to reason together, and it's best to keep a cool head because passion. As soon as you demonize the other, you make yourself stupid. Then you can't You're not going to learn anything by doing that. Now, there are people who have abhorrent opinions, but I'm always interested in finding out what their motives are. I may not admire them, but not at all. I might be striving to do the opposite of what they would like to do. And you can't win everybody over, but if it's politics, if you can win a majority, you've won the argument.
I think Caveat wants to say something.
Yeah, radical inclusion does not mean agreeing with everybody or even liking everybody. You don't have to like anyone under radical inclusion. You do have to engage with them, you have to play with them, you have to not shut them out necessarily. But I think one of the things that is so important about Burning Man is precisely that Burning Man's highest values are not politics. That ultimately we are not doing this because we want political power or because we believe that the fundamental value by which we should live our lives is political power. On the contrary, we believe in other things. And these things enable us to try to find a common ground with people even when we disagree with them. And that's what a community is. I mean, very fundamentally, if you think of it as a family, you know, we all have people in our family with whom we have political disagreements, sometimes rapidly. But nevertheless, there is some connective tissue there that we can try to reach that is deeper than our politics. I think fundamentally, if we are engaging in Burning Man effectively, then we are trying to reach that level with people where, regardless of what disagreements we have, and let's not pretend we don't have disagreements, let's not pretend we can't have arguments, but that there is something more profound and fundamental that we are trying to live our lives by.
I can't tell you what it is, but we're already working on next year's theme, and it will probably engender a lot of very lively debate.
So speaking of common ground.
Actually, can I?
Okay, go ahead.
Can I just say that? Yeah, actually, the last couple of themes, I think Larry really has been walking into taboos and into controversy. And there's nothing wrong with that. You get a lot of intellectual and artistic charge out of that. There's nothing wrong with walking into the taboo. But again, we're not holding that the agreement with a given position is the best thing that you can do with this. On the contrary, engaging your humanity is the best thing you can do with this.
One of my pet peeves is when people say, well, Burning Man is for the like-minded. What does that mean?
Like-minded. So let's go out. I got one more question about finding the common ground. And Larry, I know that over the last 30 years you've traveled a lot. You've talked to so many people, religious leaders, political leaders, people across the spectrum. And I know that you will. It's one of your strengths. I know that you will sit down and talk to just about anybody. But is there a through line to all of that? Are there things that we all care about? Are there values that resonate from within our community and out into the larger world? Is there anything you want to highlight?
I don't quite understand your question.
Is there something we all want?
Well, philosophically speaking, I've always held that that what people fundamentally want really doesn't have so much to do with their desires. I think that when people are well, look at our society. It's addicted to desire in the form of consumerism. And, but I think that's the degraded process of a failed attempt to experience a greater being. When that fails, for whatever reason, I'm a Freudian, so I usually locate that in very early experience. Then people resort to lust and the desire to acquire and possess. But that has a lot to do with the fragility of their egos, and that may be because it's difficult for them to feel that their being is real, and that and that it connects them to others' being. I said in that essay I wrote this year, it's talking about religion, that I go to churches and I say to people, I've done this. In fact, well, I'll tell you later. And said, proposed a thought experiment and said to folks, this was at a church. I said, you know, what if we invited people from every faith and assembled them together and posed a question to them, asking them to decide between them of which supreme being of all the supremely potent beings that mankind has worshipped is really real? And then we locked the door and came back a day later, and we probably only find hanks of hair and pieces of bone. So fierce would be the force of contradiction. But what if all of us here now simply reversed the word order and said, this is a trick, but it's a good trick, reversed the word order and said being is supreme? And that's over, you know, I'm nearly 7 decades old, and one does learn things from experience, and that's come to be my sentiment, my belief that being is supreme, and when being is thwarted, then it turns into egotistical behavior that is that roils a lot of very intemperate passions that disturb the individual and certainly are not terribly good for society at large. I think we all want to be real. From the moment we're born, I'm interested in developmental psychology. I have a son, he's now an adult, but when he was little, he would do two things. I was just fascinated by it. He would say, whenever, as I intuited, whenever he felt something coming up from inside of him that felt vital and real, he'd say, look at me, look at me. He wasn't asking for a critique. He wasn't asking for an endorsement. He just wanted an active witness so that he would be sure that that was real. And when I gave that to him, he'd go on his way autonomously, didn't need me anymore, and proceed to be himself. I watched that happen time again. And the other thing he would say to children of that age will say is, pick me up. Anyone who's a parent knows that those are the two big things. Pick me up, because he wanted to merge with me in my superior power as he experienced it, much as people behave towards gods, and to merge, and then the supreme pleasure for me to lift him up above my head. You know, it thrills them. It's a guaranteed hit with any kid, unless maybe they're afraid of heights. you know, both of those are a kind of quest for being, because the child is working very hard, harder than you or I at becoming a person. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lifetime of work. We never complete it, and that's about being. So we're back to a spiritual theme there, and what is being? Well, you know, figure that out for yourself. But we tend to know it when we feel it or see it in others.
Right. I think we have time left for a couple of questions. We've got some mics set up in the stands if anybody wants to jump up and grab a mic. Free for all. Take turns now.
Check. A thought came to mind when you mentioned burners being classified as like-minded, and it was a quote, I think it's by Hazrat Inayat Khan, which is, all like is knowledge and all dislike ignorance.
Huh.
So from that perspective, it seemed like a pretty good thing that we're like-minded.
Cool.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
There's an echo. It's a little difficult.
I'll just say the quote one more time on your behalf. So the quote is, all like is knowledge and all dislike is ignorance. So it would be fine for burners to be the like-minded people.
I'm not sure I like that quote.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You don't have to. The other thought I had was, just, there's another root to the word religion and its interpretation, which is the Latin root of, I think it's re larges,
Yeah.
which is reconnect.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, it's religion. And you could say, like, the implied question is connect to what? And maybe borrow Nirvana's root word is no difference.
Well pointed out.
So connect to everything. So from that perspective, hallelujah.
Thanks for that. All right, left side.
If you look at religion and you strip away the part about the invisible being, the root of the success is a tribalism. If you look at politics and you look at success and all of the problems we have right now for both of them, the root of it is tribalism. If you look at Burning Man, we have a number of tribes who have learned to play together. We have carrots and rabbits living together. And I'm wondering if you have any observations for ways to diffuse tribalism through play.
Well, I think that this actually takes us to the theme of ritual again. Another interview that I conducted, again, it's on the Burning Man Journal in the Radical Ritual series, was with the Countess, Megan Heller, an anthropologist, who pointed out that play and ritual actually are very similar to one another as forms of cognition. That, in fact, you're in many ways doing the same thing when you create a ritual and when you play. And to the extent that we are in a world with tribes that are set against one another, to the extent that we have different epistemologies, to the extent that we have reached a breakdown where we cannot argue with one another and convince one another anymore, which is what the world often looks like just at the moment, it may very well be that it is our common play and engagement around activities, that is to say ritual, that is to say ritual play, that still has a unifying power. That, as in Burning Man, it doesn't really matter what you believe, but we all come together and this is a thing that we do. If we are able to reach out to people in the broader world and come together around common activities that, as Stuart suggested earlier, actually encode values, we may very well be able to find unity through doing and action in a way that we cannot through argument and debate at this point. That strikes me as distinctly possible.
Let me add to that. Yeah, Burning Man is a social experiment, and we found over the years, this theme does point out the fact that the Burning Man culture at the event is saturated with various kinds of ritual, all of which have spontaneously evolved. None have been ordained. None. And I at least think that this happens in certain very definite social circumstances. If you can get enough people playing together and laboring together at the same time, laboring in particular, especially when they labor to give to a gift that's given to a larger society. And what those two experiences, those two activities, as you put it, produce is a kind of self-forgetfulness. What's so cringeworthy about a lot of New Age ritual is it's so self-conscious and contrived. So much of it is just, it's not bad, it's just tacky. But you can cite, this year the man is going to be, and it's not the Temple of the Man, it's Temple of the Golden Spike, and the Golden Spike, it comes out of a ritual that the DPW, that evolved as they worked and played together at the same time. And any society that can engineer that then will spontaneously and with great creative effect produce bodies of ritual that rehearse and reaffirm not only the identity of the individual, but indeed their relation to everyone around them.
I would just add briefly that, I mean, we talk about diffusing that aspect of tribalism. I mean, those two examples to me, nationalism and religion, are examples of the tribal instinct being basically subverted for exclusion of others. So I kind of keep going back to radical inclusion, right? It's great to have team spirit until you start saying, you're outside of our team and we're going to stone you. So as long as, I mean, I think that's the key to it. I think that's being open to the group being permeable and being open to everyone, rather than it just being an us against them situation that isolates the other. Yeah.
So you spoke of American Dream earlier, and it's funny because my camp sort of came together that year. People had been going, okay, let's do a camp this year. And we found it actually very easy to use that theme and run with it, and it was a fantastic year. I was one of the people that thought it was great. And this year, every year since then, we've tried to incorporate the theme into what we do, and I have to say this year has been the hardest for us to really come up with something to do. Usually it's your speech that helps, sometimes inspire us before.
Yes. We're about to come out with this. Kathy and I are working on this, some suggestions about how one can participate in this theme, which on the face of it could sound a little abstract. I can give you a few suggestions. I'll preview it a little bit.
Well, I think part of the trouble we've been having, like our own personal journey, we're mostly gay camp. And a lot of us, I was raised very fundamentalist, and we wanted to stay as far away from religion as we possibly could after we came out of that experience. And Stuart's definition of religion is the one that we all want to shy away from. There's this big daddy in the sky that tells us what to do. So oddly enough, I became involved with Unitarians and actually became a religion minor, and we found out that when you surveyed people, the reason they actually were interested in religion really wasn't the big daddy in the sky as much. It was the community and the ritual. And I think for a lot of people, we don't want to call it a religion. We want to shut away from that. But we've got this giant religion hole in us where there was this community and there was these rituals that we don't have anymore, and we want to put back into it. And I remember listening to one Unitarian mother. She was saying that her child saw these other kids that were jumping for Jesus. And as a humanist, we had nothing as that much fun to do as jumping for Jesus. And I think, we've got this, we feel like we do these rituals, we do these things, but we're like, it's a religion substitute. It's saccharine. We've never fully embraced that. Yeah, we may not have the big daddy in the sky, but these things are just as important to us, and they're on the same playing field as the people that have the stuff that they put the R word to.
So a church without God.
Church without God.
Anybody here belong to the First Church of the Jerk? Yes. Covered dishes, church supper, choir, all that stuff is pretty awesome.
Well, it's the First Church of the Jerk is an interesting example. In one sense, it's a send-up, right? But they build a classic church altar with and
only in the sense that
there were
the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence are a
pews.
send-up. They're actually a
There
real
were
charitable
pews
order.
in the church. The same thing was done at the church trap, which was satiric and yet created a church with pews and even an organ at the front, and it was much beloved. In the end, it was sort of a church for people who would never belong to a church, and in the end, they had weddings there. Now, you can't tell me that was just, a cynical joke. I mean, they were solemnizing, their union. And they were honoring that, and in honoring their union, and in some sense, they were honoring being together, being itself. And that close and that passionate of a connection, which is lacking from a lot of very ecumenical religion, I agree.
The best I could come up with is, since we're a gay camp, it's like, what is temple to us was traditionally the gay bar. So we're going to put up a big mirror ball maybe and say that's our temple. But I don't know.
Nice.
Needs work.
Well, there are, I don't want to really get into it, but there are ways of sacralizing things that are as old as humanity, and that will instill a certain mood. And while at the same time, as with the Church of the Jerk, can be leave your mind entirely free. That's a creative challenge. But Burning Man should be a creative challenge. If it were all like-minded people, God, it'd be so boring.
That mirror ball could be the axis mundi. It could be the navel of the world, right? It can be anywhere you want it to be, right? That's how you create sacred space.
In many
Just say
ways,
it's sacred.
Yeah, in many ways, the religious impulse is not about the theology or the doctrine, but the recognition in one's life that something is meaningful, that there is meaning, and that we want to orient ourselves to that. And from there, everything else follows one way or the other. And that can very much be a joyful process. And I absolutely agree that it attempts to sort of just create a shell of that are hollow and unengaging. But if you move towards the meaning, whatever that is, if you just are willing to say, yeah, there's something meaningful here, and I want to connect with it, then you're on your way.
William James said, all that's practically required is that thing be larger than your conscious self. That's all. That means, like good art, bad art, you know the meaning, it's there, there's nothing to discover. That's Norman Rockwell. Sorry, folks.
Oh.
You see nothing in Norman Rockwell you didn't expect to
Thunderdome.
see. And it's not been socially embalmed before you see it.
That's what Philosophical Center broke up.
And good art always has some element of the unknown, even to the artist. That's why artists are in some ways humble about their work, because it comes from their muse, their genius. It passes through them. They don't fully fathom it. They do it. In fact, it's sometimes asking artists to explain their work will yield you nothing. But what is true of art is also true of what we're talking about. It should be, if it's larger than your conscious self, then you can't put it in a can and wholly contain it or understand it. Now, the interesting thing is, if you go to a lot of churches, you find that the congregants, by and large, are there for communion with other people and the sense of being together to honor something that's greater than them, like Burning Man. And it's the atheists who know all the doctrine. they're experts at it.
The devil quotes scripture.
So, what we're saying is look at their behavior, look at their actions, look at people's experience, and instead of descending into a political dialogue in which nobody talks to anybody apart from their ideological stance.
That, I'm afraid, is all the time we have. Please give it up. Thanks to Larry Harvey. Caveat to you guys. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Exit stage right.